If you are 65 today with a pension pot worth £400,000, there is a strong chance that by the time you turn 75, that pot will not be smaller. It will be larger, not because you kept adding to it, but because you barely touched it. Most years, the growth inside the pot outpaces whatever modest amount you draw out to live on. You have done everything the standard advice told you to do. You retired, you draw a modest income, and you leave the rest invested and growing. Every time you log into your pension provider's account and see the balance tick upward, it feels like proof you got this right. Ask yourself honestly, when did you last check what that pot is actually worth, rather than what you assumed it was worth? For most people, the answer is months ago, maybe longer, because a rising number does not feel urgent enough to interrupt. There is a date worth circling now, the 6th of April, 2027. On that morning, the rule of thumb every advisor has repeated for 20 years, leave your pension until last, stops working the way it used to. Because of a change to UK tax law, a pension pot that keeps growing after you are gone is no longer invisible to the taxman. It becomes part of your estate, and anything above the thresholds faces a bill of 40%. That is not a penalty for doing something wrong. It is simply what happens to unspent growth once the rule changes underneath it. I am going to show you why pots grow by accident, even when you think you are spending sensibly, and 3 HMRC-approved ways to move that money toward your family now, while the 2027 deadline is still ahead of you. If you are in that 55 to 65 window and you want to protect the pot you spent 40 years building from a 40% hit, stay with me. Hit subscribe. We are working through the 2027 shift together. Here is the number that explains most of this problem. In the 2026 to 2027 tax year, the full new state pension pays £241.30 a week, which comes to £12,547.60 a year. The personal allowance is frozen at £12,570. That leaves you £22.40 of tax-free headroom before anything else you touch gets taxed. £22.40, roughly the cost of a supermarket shop, is all that stands between your state pension, the basic rate band. The personal allowance has been frozen for years now, while the state pension keeps rising with the triple lock. Every year the gap narrows. It is not a trick. It is just two numbers moving toward each other, and one of them is about to win. I have talked to people who describe the same instinct once that state pension lands. They quietly turn down the tap on their private pension, drawing less than they could, just to stay clear of the 20% tax bracket. It feels responsible. It feels like restraint. It sounds sensible, and in the short term it is. But this is the mechanism nobody explains properly. Say your £400,000 pot grows at a modest 5% a year, adding around £20,000. If you only draw £10,000 to top up your lifestyle, the other £10,000 stays in the pot and keeps compounding the same way it did the year before and the year before that. You are not being greedy by leaving it there. You are being instinctively tax efficient. That instinct is about to become expensive, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment, because nothing about your behavior needs to change for the outcome to get worse. For 20 years, the financial industry told people to spend their savings first and leave the pension until last, because a pension sat outside your estate for inheritance tax. That advice was not wrong when it was given. It is the trap now, quietly built from good advice that outlived its own logic. So exactly how much of that accidental growth will the Treasury take from 2027 onward? Let's look at the 40% math. From the 6th of April 2027, most unused pension funds and death benefits get pulled into your estate for inheritance tax. That is the actual change. Before that date, your pension sits largely outside the calculation, treated almost like it belongs to a different part of your life. After it, HMRC treats it much like your house or your savings account, just another asset added up on the same form. There is one exemption that matters more than any other, and it is the one people misunderstand most often. If you leave your pension to a spouse or civil partner, there is no inheritance tax to pay. None. Money can pass between partners freely, the same way it always has. The 40% bill almost always lands later, on the death of the surviving partner, when what is left passes down to children. That is the moment most families never plan for, because it feels distant until it suddenly is not. Think about how your house has quietly grown in value since you bought it, without you doing anything at all to make that happen. Your pension can behave the same way once you stop actively drawing it down. The difference is that your house has always sat inside your estate. From 2027, your pension joins it. I do not know your exact family setup, and tax rules are a moving target, but the 2027 shift is the biggest change to death benefits I have seen described in this line of work. This is why the timing matters so much. According to ONS life expectancy figures, a 65-year-old today can expect around 20 more years of life, taking them into their mid-80s. That figure matters here because it is not really about how long you live, it is about how long your pension has to keep growing quietly in the background. That is 20 years of potential growth sitting inside a pot that, after 2027, sits fully inside the tax net, compounding away while nobody is watching the clock. Nobody sends you a letter to tell you it happened. The bill just arrives, once, at the end. A modest £150,000 pot growing at the same pace for 15 years can pass £300,000 without a single extra contribution from you. That is the arithmetic working exactly as intended, just working against the family instead of for them once the pension sits inside the estate. If you are thinking your pot is too modest for any of this to matter, hold that thought. Wait until you see what 15 years of ordinary growth does to a pot that starts out looking perfectly reasonable. Picture two people, both starting at 67, with the same £400,000 pension pot, the same age, the same broad health, making one different choice each year about how much to draw. The first person, call her the storer, draws only the minimum she needs. She lets the rest sit and grow, telling herself she is being careful. By the time she is 80, under the rules that apply from 2027, her pot has grown to around £550,000 bigger than the day she retired, even after 13 years of living off it. None of this requires the storer to do anything unusual. Her pension stays invested in a typical mix of shares and bonds, the same kind of fund most default pensions use, and markets tend to drift upward more often than not over a decade. She is not gambling. She is simply not interrupting the process. The second person, the strategist, draws £20,000 a year on purpose, even in years she does not strictly need all of it. Some of that money goes on things she actually wants, some of it she gives away while she is alive to see it used. Her pot stays close to level, still around £400,000 at 80. This is where it gets uncomfortable. On the second death, once the money passes to children, the storer's estate faces a 40% inheritance tax bill on that £550,000 pot. That works out to roughly £220,000 handed to HMRC, more than many people paid for their house. The strategist's pot, staying near £400,000, produces a bill closer to £160,000. That is a £60,000 difference, created entirely by which one of them chose to spend the money while they were alive. £60,000 is not a rounding error. It is close to 15 years of an average household's energy bills, or a mortgage cleared early for one of their children. The storer felt richer every time she checked her balance. Her children ended up considerably poorer, and neither the reasons nor the numbers were ever explained to them while she was alive to do it. That gap did not appear because the storer did anything wrong. It appeared because inheritance tax rules changed underneath a strategy that used to make sense, and correcting for it requires nothing more complicated than spending a bit more of your own money while you are the one enjoying it. If any of this sounds familiar, it might be because you have caught yourself thinking that leaving money behind feels safer than spending it. That feeling is common. After 2027, it is also the expensive one. So if storing the money is the real risk, the obvious next question is how you actually get money out of a pension without HMRC taking 20% or 40% of it, while you are still here to see it spent. There is a rule in UK tax law that barely gets talked about, and it might be the most useful one for anyone sitting on a pension that keeps growing. It is called normal expenditure out of income, and it has existed for a long time, quietly overlooked while everyone focuses on the headlines about the pension changes. It works like this. If your income, your state pension, your private pension, any dividends, adds up to more than you actually spend on living costs, you can gift that surplus. As long as the gifting is regular, comes from income rather than savings, and does not reduce your own standard of living, it is exempt from inheritance tax straight away, with no waiting period attached. That is different from the usual 7-year rule that applies to large one-off gifts, where you have to survive 7 years before the gift falls outside your estate. Gifts from genuine surplus income skip that wait entirely, which matters if you are already in your 70s and cannot count on 7 more years with any certainty. The catch, if you can call it that, is documentation. HMRC wants to see a pattern, not a single generous year. Keep a simple record of what comes in and what goes out, the same way you would keep a mortgage statement or a council tax bill, and the exemption holds up if it is ever questioned. A simple record updated once a year is normally enough, listing what came in, what went out on living costs, and what was left over to give. It is really just an honest household budget with the surplus circled. I used to tell people to keep their pension withdrawals low, to stay tax efficient on the way in. I was wrong for a world where the pot itself becomes the tax bill. The goal now looks more like planned, steady leakage, spending and giving a little more than feels natural, on purpose. In numbers, it looks like this. If you have £5,000 a year sitting as genuine surplus, gifting that consistently over 10 years moves £50,000 out of the 40% zone completely, with no waiting period at all, and your family sees the benefit of that money decades before a solicitor is ever involved. Gifting is not the only lever, though. Sometimes the most effective tax planning is a holiday you actually go on. Once you accept that an idle pension is a liability rather than a trophy, the actual choices are fairly simple. There are 3 honest ways to spend that tend to work for most people in this position. The first move is what I call the basic rate fill. Draw enough from your pension each year to use up your full 20% tax bracket, which runs up to £50,270 in the 2026 to 2027 tax year. Paying 20% now genuinely beats your children paying 40% later on the same money. It feels strange the first time you do it on purpose, drawing more than you technically need, but the arithmetic does not change just because it feels unfamiliar. The second move is building what you might call a deadline fund. Make a real list of the things you cannot do at 85 that you can still do now. Long-haul travel while your knees still cooperate, doing up the house properly instead of patching it, helping a grandchild with a deposit on their first place while it still changes their life, rather than just topping up an inheritance years later. The third move is shifting some of that pension wealth into an ISA over time. ISAs still count as part of your estate for inheritance tax, so this is not a way around the tax itself, and it is worth being honest about that up front. What it buys you is flexibility, since money in an ISA is far easier to access and gift while you are alive than money still locked inside pension rules, drawdown limits, and provider paperwork. None of these 3 moves require dramatic change. They require doing on purpose what most people only do by accident. Later, when it is too late to matter, none of them depend on predicting markets or timing the next budget either. They depend only on deciding this year to treat some of that surplus as spendable rather than untouchable, and reviewing that decision again next year on purpose. There is one psychological barrier, though, that stops around 90% of people from acting on any of this. The barrier is fear, and it is a rational one. It usually sounds something like this in your own head: if I spend the pot now, what happens if I need long-term care later and there is nothing left? UK care costs are genuinely high, so that fear is not irrational or dramatic. It deserves to be taken seriously rather than brushed aside. And anyone who tells you to simply stop worrying about it has probably never had to price a care home for a parent. But notice what the fear is actually protecting. It is what you might call a precautionary instinct, the habit of holding resources back against an uncertain future cost. It served people well for most of their working lives. It becomes less useful once the specific risk it was guarding against, running out of money in old age, gets weighed against a new and certain one, losing 40% of the surplus to tax. This is the reframe that actually helps. Your pension pot does not need to double as your care fund. For most people, the home is the asset that gets assessed first when care costs come into the picture, not the pension. The pension is the piece that 2027 is specifically targeting for inheritance tax, which makes it easier to think of as a legacy fund rather than an emergency fund. I have sat with couples who have £600,000 sitting in accounts and pensions and still will not replace an aging car, just in case. Meanwhile, the tax bill on that money is already being calculated, whether they spend it or not, running quietly in the background, regardless of how carefully they live. Ask yourself what you are actually protecting against, and whether spending sensibly now would really put that protection at risk. A pension pot that is still growing at 75 is not a trophy. After the 2027 tax change lands, it is a liability waiting to be collected, and the size of that liability grows every year you leave it alone. Use the surplus income rule while it still applies to you. Fill your 20% tax bracket on purpose instead of avoiding it. Start building your legacy while you are still around to watch your family use it, rather than leaving HMRC to explain the arithmetic to them later. If you want a deeper walkthrough of how gifting rules actually work in practice, there is a video on this channel that covers exactly that. Subscribe if you want to keep working through the 2027 changes together. You spent 40 years funding a retirement, not a tax bill. Do not let the 2027 deadline decide that for you.